Hi everybody, Matthew Turnage here. Today I'm continuing my series of reviewing through the Beatles and solo Beatles studio albums. And today we're going to talk about George Harrison's Cloud Nine. And this album was released in 1987. It was George's first album of new material in 5 years, which at the time was quite a layoff. Of course, these days, 5 years between albums is not quite as big of a deal as it was then. But after taking a break from releasing new music to focus more on his film company, George returned with this album and returned to the charts, the top of the charts as well. He hit this album hit number 8 in the U.S. and number 10 in the U.K. And of course, it spawned not only George's most recent number one single, but the most recent number one single by any of the former Beatles, when Got My Mind Set on You hit number one in early 1988. And was still on the charts early that year when the Beatles were inducted into the Hall of Fame, which meant George had the rare privilege of being an artist who still had a song on the charts when he was inducted into the Hall of Fame for the first time. So I'll just go through the tracks. I think it's a really strong album from George. It's definitely one of his best, and produced by George and Jeff Lynne, who I think did a great job with this album. It does bear a lot of hallmarks sonically to the decade in which it was released, but as somebody who grew up in that era and likes the music of the 1980s, that's all right with me. So we'll kick off going through all the tracks with the opening track, which is the title track, Cloud Nine. And I think it's a strong song. It's a good opener. There's a little bit darker mood to it, just a little hint of something maybe like that to me. I think it's got some really cool saxophone work in it. I like that sax lick that recurs throughout. And great guitar work in there too. This is one of 4 tracks that features George's old buddy Eric Clapton playing guitar on it. And I'm not sure. Tell me if in the comments if you know differently, but it sounds to me like as we have at the beginning guitars, there's 2 guitars, one in each speaker there. I think George is on the left and Eric is on the right. It's kind of what it sounds like to me, but there's some really nice guitar work and some interplay between the guitars throughout there. Jeff Lynne's production on this, I think, is very strong. It's a very slick sounding album, and that's evident straight from the first track. But I think Jeff does a really good job with it. And it's a great sounding song and great vocals from George. So the second track up is That's What It Takes, which is a little more up tempo. It's a nice tune with a lot of energy, and again, Eric Clapton is on this track, plays some great guitar, has a nice little solo at the end that's really cool, and nice backing vocals throughout this whole song. This is one of the tracks where you definitely hear Jeff Lynne coming in the backing vocals. But I think it's a really good song and kind of keeps the album going on a very strong, in a strong direction. And that brings us to the third track, A Fish on the Sand, which is one of my 2 favorite songs on the album. I think it's absolutely brilliant. It has a lot of energy, fast tempo. It really rocks. I think it's one of George's best songs. It's more kind of a rocker. Lyrically, it's a love song, and I really like the lyrics a lot. It's sort of interesting idea George is trying to get across as he's expressing his love for a woman. We'll presume it's Olivia, and saying, the chorus is, I love you, I need you. When I'm not with you, I'm not so much of a man. I'm like a fish on the sand. So the idea of being out of your element, of being helpless, of struggling, you think of the imagery of a fish on the sand, and that's how George feels when he's not when he's not with his woman. So it's a great song lyrically, and there's a sense of urgency and desperation to the lyrics that translates very well into the music. The music really communicates. It has that urgency. It has that desperation to it. So I think it's just an amazing song. I love it. It's one of, like I said, one of my two favorite songs on this album, and probably one of my very favorite George Harrison songs overall. I think it's a great tune. So we've got that good up-tempo rocker, and then we slow things down a bit with the next track, Just for Today. This song is a bit more piano-driven, sort of a ballad. And to me, it really feels like it could have fit in on Living in the Material World. It has sort of that same kind of sense to it, musically and everything. Where I feel that some of the slower songs on Living in the Material World, there's a bit too much of them, and it kind of, for me, I know a lot of people think that's one of George's best. To me, it's more middle of the pack because I feel like some of the slower material on it bogged that album down a bit. That's not the case with this. I think it's a good sequencing in the album that we've got a really good energetic rocker just before it, and then we come into this. It kind of gives us a little change of pace. George sings great on it, but also he plays great. I think there's some really good guitar work from George on this song. Some nice backing vocals in it. The oohs and ahs, I think, are really nice. Yeah, I think it's a good song, and it fits in well with this album. It gives it a nice flow, slowing things down here. And then we pick up the pace a little bit with the next track, which is This Is Love. And this is, again, more kind of up-tempo, the very, very 80s drum sound, perhaps more so than any other song on this album. But like I said, it's a product of its time, and I like the time it was a product of, so I'm not complaining about that. It's just more of an observation. But I think George sings really great on this one. It's I think it's a really strong song. And then that leads us into one of the two hit singles to come off the album, When We Was Fab, which closes off the first side. Of course, this lyrically, George is hearkening back to his Beatles days, and there's certainly things in the musical arrangement that are meant to, I think, remind us of the Beatles. For example, the string arrangement is kind of something that you could kind of see George Martin might do something sort of like that, and it's a nice little bit of nostalgia from George lyrically. At times George seemed to want to distance himself from the Beatles, and not that I blame him for that, but it also seems like at other times he wasn't afraid to harken back on it when it might suit him commercially, like in this song, and then also in the video, and as he had previously done in the video for Ding Dong Ding Dong, donning his Sgt. Pepper uniform again. But I think it's a good song, and it ends the first side on a nice note. Then we flip over to side two, and it's my other of my two favorite songs on this album, and it's really a toss-up for me almost between Fish in the Sand and the opening track of side two, Devil's Radio, as far as which one is my favorite. Again, another up-tempo, more kind of rockin' song. Lyrically, also very interesting. Of course, it's about gossip, and George was inspired by a sign he saw in a church one day that said something like, "Gossip is the devil's radio. Don't be a broadcaster," or something like that. And I can definitely see how that would appeal to George. He did not seem like the type of person who would have a high opinion of gossipers. So he turned it into a great song. And I've heard the phrase Devil's Radio to describe gossip before. I do like what he does is he's sort of like ad-libbing toward the end, and he changes it up a bit. And when he says, I heard you on Satan's Wireless, I think that's a kind of a fun way, alternate way to say Devil's Radio. but I think it's a really great song and really great lyrics, and also one of my very favorite George Harrison solo songs. This is the third of the four songs with Eric Clapton on guitar. Clapton plays the solo on this also, and does a great job with, well, and adding little guitar licks throughout, and also piano on this track by Elton John. There's some nice rocking piano on here that Elton John provided. And while I'm mentioning famous guest stars, of course, I should say throughout the album, Ringo provides drumming along with Jim Keltner. So George called out the big guns to help out on this album here and there. Next track up is Someplace Else, and this is a nice, again, slowing down the tempo a little bit and giving us a good ballad. I think this is a really, really well done and well constructed song. The slide guitar that George provides in this is some of his very best slide work, I think. I mean, in terms of creating a mood and fitting in with the song, I think it's really great bluesy slide work that fit the song perfectly. And I really like how it the song kind of builds toward the end of the verse, and then you get back into the chorus and it kind of comes back down. And that bit where he's singing in the chorus, loneliness, empty faces, wish I could leave them all in someplace else. Really nice lyrics, and just listen to the song and you'll hear what I mean. As it just kind of builds up as we get to the end of the verse, and then kind of turns back into a little more more subtle, I guess, maybe approach in the chorus. But I think it's really very effective. It's a really, really nice song. Next up is Wreck of the Hesperus, and this is our last contribution from Eric Clapton, who does some more great guitar work throughout the whole track. Again, the saxophones in this one they're really nice. Some good saxophone work, several tracks on this album. But lyrically, one's also very interesting. It's basically George is talking about, I'm not old, but I may be old, but I'm not out of it yet. It's kind of, you think about the concept of an aging rock star, and especially in 1987, we hadn't really had rock stars active, certainly not active in the charts in their 40s before. Elvis had unfortunately died when he was 42, and a lot of the other original rockers, in their 40s weren't really having much of an impact on the charts if they were even still active. So as we come into the 80s and that 60s wave of rock stars, we had several of them that were still out and prominent as they're entering their 40s. Of course, George, Paul, the Rolling Stones. In fact, it would only be 2 years after this. I remember that at the time, the much hyped Rolling Stones Steel Wheels tour, and sort of the joke going around was it was Steel Wheels tour in description of the wheels they'll have to have on their wheelchairs as they roll out, because they were seen as being old for rock stars at the time, even though they were only, like George on this album, mid-40s. In fact, George was slightly younger when he released this album than I am now. So these days we don't think about rock stars in their 40s necessarily as being old in the same way as we did in the 80s, just because there had never been anybody really having done it before that. So now we're more used to the idea. But anyway, all that I think kind of influences George's lyrics on that. It's kind of tongue in cheek. It's pretty funny, and I love George's sense of humor anyway. But I think it comes across pretty well in Wreck of the Hesperus. Then again, another change in pace with the next song, which is Breath Away from Heaven, which has a very oriental flavor. It's it's a much more delicate song. I actually think George's vocals on it at time it's almost like he's trying to be a little too delicate because of trying to match the music. I think his vocals don't quite get there somehow. I don't know exactly how to say what I'm trying to say, but I don't know that his vocals really get across the delicacy of the music, I guess is how I would say it perfectly. But they're not bad, but it's just that would be sort of the flaw in the Persian Rug, I guess, would be his vocals on this track for me. But I do like the song well enough. It's a good song and not one that I'd want to skip. And like I said, it's a nice change of pace, both in terms of the tempo and also in terms of the style. I think it works pretty well. And then, of course, we end the song with or end the album with a cover song, and that's Got My Mind Set on You, which was written by Rudy Clark and first recorded by James Ray. And it's a great version of the song. Very 80s, of course, with the drums again and other things, but the drums particularly 80s sounding. But George does a really good job. It's got a lot of energy. It's fun. It had a very fun video for it too. That's sort of one of my first memories of being aware of who George Harrison was. I was 11 when this album came out, and I was familiar with Paul from hits that he had before when I was younger, like Say, 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 and songs like that. But with George, he had not really been on my radar as he had been kind of away from music in those years when I was 7, 8, and really started sort of paying attention to pop. So this was his first album back after I'd been sort of more paying attention to what was current in music. And so I have very fond memories of seeing that video and enjoying that video. Of course, there are a couple versions of the video. The one that I remember is the one where George is in the room with all like the crazy clocks and the animal heads on the wall and all that kind of stuff. He's sitting in the chair. But it's a great song and a fun song, and I'm glad that it went to #1 for George. It was a nice achievement for him to be, at least as of so far, the last solo Beatle #1 released by any of the four. Great song and a great album closer. Ends the album on a very positive note. So I think it's one of George's strongest albums for me. Good material all throughout. Well produced by Jeff Lynne. I think Jeff and George made a great collaboration together on this album, and I can't recommend it enough. If you're not familiar with George's solo output, I think this is a great album to start on. Obviously, most people will steer you toward All Things Must Pass, and you can't go wrong with that. But if you're thinking a triple album might be a little bit too much to bite off at once, I think this is another great alternative to introduce you to solo George Harrison. It's full of great material, great guests such as Eric Clapton and Ringo Starr and Elton John, and it's just one of my favorite George Harrison albums. Can't recommend it enough. So there you go. There's my review of Cloud 9. Hope you enjoyed it. Let me know what you think about that album in the comments. Thanks for watching.